Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the most misunderstood civilizations in human history, ancient Rome, the empire of legions, emperors, marble statues, dramatic betrayals, and at least one man who allegedly fiddled while everything burned. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you read tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Let's begin with the most dramatic lie of them all. Two gladiators enter the arena, the crowd roars, sand flies, one man falls. The emperor tilts his thumb with the casual energy of someone raiding a restaurant on a food app. Death every time, except no. If gladiator combat worked like that, Rome would have run out of gladiators by Thursday. Here's the part Hollywood tends to skip. Gladiators were expensive, painfully expensive. They were trained in professional schools called ludi, fed high-protein diets, given structured workouts, and treated by doctors who specialized in sports injuries. Yes, sports injuries, because gladiators were closer to professional athletes than disposable cannon fodder. Training one could take years. That means food, housing, trainers, equipment, and medical care. You don't invest that much time and money into someone just to eliminate them after one afternoon performance. That's not spectacle, that's financial self-sabotage. Most fights were carefully arranged to maximize drama. Heavily armored fighter versus quick and agile opponent, shield versus net, strength versus speed. It was choreography with real risk, not random chaos. And here's something else people forget. The goal was suspense. The possibility of death is thrilling. Guaranteed death less so. After the 10th guaranteed execution, even Romans would start checking their sundials. Many bouts ended when a gladiator raised a finger in surrender. The crowd reacted loudly. The sponsor of the games made the call. And despite popular imagination, survival was common. Why? Because repeat performers build hype. Gladiators had fan followings. Their names were scratched into walls in Pompeii like ancient celebrity graffiti. Women admired them. Some became wildly popular. You don't develop a fan base if you're constantly deceased. Now, were there executions? Absolutely. Were some matches fatal? Yes, the arena was dangerous, but it wasn't a guaranteed death sentence every time someone stepped into the sand. Rome loved violence. It also loved profit, and nothing ruins a profitable franchise like killing off the entire cast after episode 1. The arena wasn't just about blood. It was about drama, and drama works best when the hero might live to fight again. Now, let's address the gesture that refuses to die. The emperor sits, the defeated gladiator kneels. The crowd waits, a thumb slowly turns downward. Execution, at least that's how movies tell it. The problem is we do not actually have clear evidence that a downward thumb meant death and an upward thumb meant mercy. In fact, it may have been the opposite. Ancient Roman sources use phrases like polyverso, which translates roughly to with a turned thumb. That's it, not thumbs down, not pointing at the floor, just turned. Helpful. Some scholars believe that a thumb extended outward symbolized a drawn sword, meaning kill. A closed fist with the thumb tucked inside may have represented a sheathed sword, meaning spare him. So, the dramatic downward thumb we all recognize might not even have been the signal. It could have been the ancient equivalent of a historical mistranslation that spiraled out of control. And honestly, that tracks. The confusion largely comes from a 19th century painting by Jean-Léon Gérôme titled Palerso. In it, Roman spectators dramatically point their thumbs downward demanding blood. The painting was powerful. It shaped popular imagination. Hollywood saw it and said, "Perfect. We'll take that." But paintings are not primary sources. They are interpretations. In reality, decisions about a gladiator's fate were more complex. The sponsor of the games, often a politician seeking public approval, made the final call. The crowd influenced the decision, shouting, gesturing, waving cloths. It was less like a silent emperor judging from above and more like a loud, chaotic public referendum, which feels very Roman. The arena was political theater as much as entertainment. Sparing a skilled fighter could earn goodwill. Executing a coward might satisfy the crowd, but it wasn't a simple up or down switch. It was noisy, it was emotional, it was messy, just like Rome itself. So, the next time you picture that slow-motion thumb descending dramatically, remember, history ain't always cinematic. Sometimes it's just ambiguous. And sometimes an entire myth survives because one painter in the 1800s made a really compelling choice. Yes, the famous Roman dinner strategy: eat, recline, discuss politics, stand up, visit the vomitorium, return refreshed, continue eating. It sounds scandalous, excessive, perfectly Roman. It is also wrong. The word vomitorium has absolutely nothing to do with vomiting at dinner parties. A vomitorium was an architectural feature in large Roman buildings like amphitheaters and theaters. It was a passageway that allowed crowds to exit quickly, to be spewed forth into the streets. Spewed forth, as in people moving efficiently, not senators purging oysters between courses. The confusion likely started because the word sounds dramatic and frankly a little gross. It fits neatly into the stereotype of Rome as endlessly decadent and morally unhinged. And yes, elite Roman banquets could be extravagant. Wealthy hosts competed to impress guests with exotic foods. Peacock dormice, elaborate seafood displays. Reclining on couches while servants refilled wine was very much a thing. Did some people overindulge? Absolutely. Were there individuals who purged themselves after overeating? Probably. Humans have been inventing questionable dietary solutions for centuries, but the idea that Roman architecture included designated vomiting rooms for formal dinner etiquette is pure myth. Imagine building a luxury dining hall and intentionally including a labeled purge corridor between the appetizers and dessert. That's not cultural sophistication, that's logistical chaos. Most Romans, by the way, were not attending elite banquets at all. The majority were working-class citizens eating simple meals of bread, olives, porridge, vegetables. Maybe some fish or meat if they were fortunate. The image of constant marble feasts represents a tiny slice of society. But the myth survives because it reinforces the idea that Rome was constantly spiraling in excess. It fits the narrative of decline, of moral rot, of inevitable collapse. Reality is less theatrical. Rome had wealth. It had indulgence. It had excess. But it also had practical architecture designed for crowd control. And sometimes a word that sounds outrageous is just a hallway. History can be dramatic. It doesn't usually require a scheduled vomiting intermission to make its point. Few images are as iconic as this one. Rome is in flames. Citizens are screaming. The sky glows red. And Emperor Nero stands on a balcony calmly playing a violin while the Capitol collapses. It's dramatic. It's poetic. It's almost certainly not true. First problem: violins did not exist in the 1st century. That alone complicates the image. Second problem: according to several ancient sources, Nero was not even in Rome when the Great Fire began in 64 CE. He was in Antium, a coastal town, and reportedly rushed back to the city once news reached him. Now, was Nero controversial? Absolutely. Was he fond of performing music and poetry in public? Very much so. Did many Romans find that behavior undignified for an emperor? Yes, but the specific image of him serenading a burning city appears to have developed later, especially in hostile historical accounts, and that's important. Much of what we know about Nero comes from writers like Tacitus and Suetonius, men writing after his death during regimes that had every incentive to paint him in the worst possible light. History is often written by the winners, and Nero did not win. Now, did he potentially benefit from the fire? That's where things get interesting. After the blaze, Nero built his extravagant domus aurea, the Golden House, a massive palace complex that included gardens, artificial lakes, and lavish decorations. It did not help his public relations. In fact, many Romans suspected he may have had something to do with the fire itself. Proof: none conclusive, suspicion plenty. To deflect blame, Nero famously targeted Christians, accusing them of starting the fire and launching persecutions against them. So, was he innocent? Hard to say. Was he musically accompanying the apocalypse? Highly unlikely. The fiddling story survives because it perfectly symbolizes indifference, a ruler disconnected from suffering. It's memorable, it's sharp, it's easy to retell, but history is rarely that neat. Nero may have been vain, dramatic, and politically reckless, but the image of him calmly performing while Rome burned is more literary metaphor than documented fact. Sometimes legends stick because they feel right, not because they are. If you close your eyes and picture ancient Rome, you probably see a city full of men dramatically wrapped in white sheets, strolling through marble streets like they're permanently late for a Senate meeting. That's the toga myth. The toga was not everyday wear. It was formal attire, heavy, layered, and spectacularly impractical. A toga was made of wool, draped in a complex arrangement that required practice to wear correctly. It could weigh several kilograms. It restricted movement. It was not something you threw on casually to go buy bread. Imagine trying to farm, build roads, or chase someone through the forum while wrapped in a carefully folded woolen curtain. Exactly, most Roman men wore tunics in daily life. Simple, functional garments suited for work and movement. Soldiers wore armor. Laborers wore sturdy clothing appropriate for their tasks. Even senators only wore togas during official duties. The toga was a symbol. It represented citizenship and status. Only Roman male citizens had the right to wear certain types of togas. There were variations: the toga virilis for adult men, the toga pretext with a purple border for magistrates and elite youth. It was political clothing, ceremonial clothing, not casual street wear. And it was hot. Rome is not a mild climate. Walking around Mediterranean streets, wrapped in thick wool, was not a lifestyle choice most people would make voluntarily unless social expectations required it. There are even historical complaints about how uncomfortable and inconvenient the toga was, which is strangely relatable. Fashion over function is not a modern invention. Now, here's the interesting part. Because the toga was associated with citizenship, wearing one became a statement of identity. It distinguished Romans from foreigners. It projected dignity and authority. So, when we imagine all Romans constantly in togas, we are accidentally projecting a symbolic garment into everyday life. It's like assuming modern people wear tuxedos to the grocery store because tuxedos represent formal status. Rome loved symbolism, but it also loved practicality, and practicality won on workdays. So, no, ancient Rome was not a city of permanent sheet enthusiasts. It was a city of tunics with occasional dramatic wool. Let's clear this one up carefully, because this myth quietly reshapes how people understand Roman history. Julius Caesar was not an emperor. He was dictator perpetual, dictator for life. That title alone is dramatic enough. It does not need upgrading. When most people think of Rome, they imagine emperors ruling with absolute power. Golden laurel wreaths, marble busts staring into eternity. That system began after Caesar. Before him, Rome was technically a republic. It had senators, magistrates, elections, and a complicated web of power sharing that was designed, at least in theory, to prevent one man from taking total control. Now, in practice, that system had been under stress for decades. Political violence was increasing. Powerful generals were building personal armies loyal to themselves rather than the state. Enter Caesar. He was a brilliant general, a master of propaganda, and very aware of his popularity. After conquering Gaul and marching his army across the Rubicon, which was legally speaking not something you were supposed to do, he plunged Rome into civil war. He won, and then he accumulated power not as emperor, but as dictator for life. That distinction matters because emperor implies a formal recognized system of imperial rule. Caesar never ruled under that title. he pushed the republic to its breaking point. And then in 44 BCE, he was assassinated by senators who believed they were saving the republic from tyranny. Spoiler, they did not. Instead of restoring the old system, the assassination triggered more civil wars. Eventually, Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, emerged victorious. Octavian became Augustus. Augustus became the first true Roman emperor. So, ironically, killing Caesar did not stop one-man rule. It cleared the path for a more stable, permanent version of it. History has a dry sense of humor. The men who stabbed Caesar believed they were ending a dictatorship. They accidentally helped invent an empire. So no, Julius Caesar was not emperor. He was the bridge between republic and empire, which might actually be more historically important and arguably more complicated than simply handing him a crown he never officially wore. If you ask most people when Rome fell, they'll confidently say 476, one date, one collapse, curtain closed. It sounds clean, final, cinematic. Unfortunately, history rarely behaves that neatly. The year 476 marks the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire. A Germanic leader named Odoacer removed him from power. That moment is often labeled the fall of Rome, but by that point, Rome had been unraveling for generations. Political instability had become routine. Emperors rose and fell with alarming speed. Some ruled for months. Some barely had time to unpack their armor. Civil wars drained resources. Rival clans battled for legitimacy. Meanwhile, the empire's borders were under constant pressure. Germanic tribes moved into Roman territory, sometimes as invaders, sometimes as federated allies who were supposed to defend the empire, but occasionally decided to renegotiate the arrangement with swords. The economy struggled, tax systems faltered. Military recruitment became more difficult. Maintaining a massive empire required enormous administrative effort and constant revenue. It was less a sudden explosion and more a slow structural crack spreading through marble. And here's the part people forget. The Eastern Roman Empire did not fall in 476. It continued for nearly 1,000 more years. Centered in Constantinople, the Eastern Empire, which we call the Byzantine Empire, preserved Roman law, culture, and administrative systems long after the West fragmented. So Rome did not collapse in a single fiery moment. The western half fractured gradually, transforming into various kingdoms ruled by former Roman officials and Germanic leaders who often adopted Roman customs. Roman law influenced medieval Europe. Roman roads were still used. Roman identity persisted in different forms. The idea that Rome fell overnight is appealing because it offers a clear ending. But the reality is more complex. Rome did not die. It changed, it adapted, it fragmented, it evolved into something else. Empires rarely vanish in a single scene. They erode. And sometimes they linger far longer than the date in your textbook suggests. If movies are your primary source, ancient Rome looked like one endless rooftop party. Marble villas, reclining couches, grapes being casually hand-fed, wine flowing like a broken aqueduct, senators discussing politics between bites of peacock. And yes, that version of Rome did exist for a tiny elite percentage of society. The problem is we tend to zoom in on the most outrageous slice of Roman life and assume it represents everyone. Most Romans were not reclining at banquets. They were working. Rome was a massive urban machine. Bakers woke up early to prepare bread. Blacksmiths hammered tools. Merchants negotiated prices in noisy markets. Laborers carried goods through crowded streets. Farmers outside the city worried about harvest, weather, and taxes. Daily life revolved around survival, trade, and family, not non-stop indulgence. Even among the elite, decadence wasn't constant. Political careers required public visibility and strategic alliances. Reputation mattered. Being seen as excessively indulgent could damage credibility. And while wine was common, it was usually diluted with water. Drinking undiluted wine was considered juvenilized behavior, something associated with barbarians. So the idea that Romans were perpetually intoxicated is exaggerated. Now, were there infamous figures known for excess? Of course, emperors like Caligula and Commodus developed reputations for extravagance and instability. Certain aristocrats hosted lavish feasts that pushed the boundaries of taste. But extreme examples are memorable precisely because they were extreme. If every Roman lived in permanent chaos, it would not have been worth commenting on. What sustained Rome for centuries was not decadence. It was administration, infrastructure, trade networks, military organization, law. You cannot govern vast territories while permanently hung over. Well, not effectively. The myth of constant Roman excess survives because it fits a moral narrative that Rome collapsed because it became too indulgent. It's a convenient story, but civilizations are more complicated than that. Rome was flawed. It was ambitious. It was brutal at times, but it was also disciplined enough to maintain order across continents. And that doesn't happen if everyone is permanently reclining with a goblet. There's a certain image burned into popular imagination. A wall of shields, perfect formation, red cloaks flowing, the Roman legion advancing like a human machine that simply does not lose. And to be fair, Roman soldiers were extremely effective, but invincible, not even close. The Roman military machine was disciplined, organized, and innovative. Legions trained rigorously, they built roads as they marched. They constructed fortified camps every single night. They adapted tactics based on terrain and enemy strategy. But they also suffered catastrophic defeats. One of the most famous disasters occurred in 09 CE in the Teutoburg forest. 3 Roman legions marched into what they thought was friendly territory under the guidance of a local leader named Arminius. He betrayed them in dense forest. Roman formations collapsed. Heavy armor became a liability. Ambush tactics overwhelmed the legions. By the end, tens of thousands were dead. The Roman Empire never fully expanded into Germania after that. Invincible armies do not suffer humiliations like that. There were other setbacks, too. Legions were defeated by Parthian cavalry at Carrhae. Civil wars drained manpower. Internal rivalries sometimes caused more damage than external enemies. Rome's strength was not perfection, it was recovery. After disasters, they rebuilt. They reformed tactics, they recruited new soldiers. They learned from mistakes. The Roman army evolved over centuries. From maniple formations to cohort systems, from citizen militias to professional standing forces. And even at its peak, Roman military dominance depended heavily on logistics, alliances, and political stability. When internal corruption or economic strain weakened the system, the army's effectiveness declined. So no, Roman soldiers were not mythic superheroes who never lost. They were highly trained professionals in a powerful military structure that sometimes failed. Spectacularly, what made Rome formidable was not that it never fell. It was that it could stand back up again and again until eventually it couldn't. Invincibility is a legend, resilience is history, and Rome had resilience in abundance for a very long time. For some reason, a persistent image exists of Romans trudging through sewage-filled streets covered in grime, never having discovered the concept of soap. That image is misplaced. Romans were, by ancient standards, impressively clean. Public baths were everywhere, not just in Rome itself, but throughout the empire. Large bath complexes included hot rooms, warm rooms, cold plunges, exercise courtyards, and social spaces. Bathing was not a rare luxury for the ultra-wealthy, it was a regular part of urban life. For a small fee, citizens could enter and spend hours moving between heated rooms, scraping oil from their skin with a tool called a stridle, socializing, discussing politics, or negotiating business deals. Yes, baths were social hubs. Think gym, spa, networking lounge, and public forum all combined, except with more steam and fewer motivational posters. And then there were aqueducts. Massive engineering projects carried fresh water into cities from distant sources. Some Roman cities had running fountains in public squares. Sewage systems like the Cloaca Maxima drained waste away from populated areas. Were they perfectly sanitary by modern standards? No, they did not understand germ theory. Bathwater was shared. Soap was not used in the way we use it today. But compared to many other ancient societies, Roman infrastructure was advanced. The stereotype of universal filth likely comes from later periods in European history when bathing habits changed and urban sanitation declined. Ironically, medieval cities often had fewer public bathing facilities than ancient Rome. The Romans valued appearance. Cleanliness was tied to social status and public respectability. A well-groomed citizen signaled discipline and order. Of course, not everyone had equal access. Rural populations lived differently from urban elites. Slums existed, poverty existed. But the idea that Romans simply wallowed in dirt is misleading. They invested heavily in water systems and public hygiene spaces. You do not build massive aqueduct networks if you have no interest in staying clean. So no, Rome was not a giant open sewer. It was a complex urban civilization that in many ways understood the importance of washing up better than some eras that followed it, which is not something people expect to hear. There's a tendency to picture Roman society in extremes. On one side, senators draped in luxury dining beneath painted ceilings. On the other, enslaved laborers chained to oaths or fields. While both of those realities existed, they do not capture the full picture. Rome was not a two-layer cake. It was a layered, complicated social structure with multiple levels in between. Yes, slavery was widespread. Enslaved people worked in households, mines, farms, workshops, and administrative offices. It was a brutal system that powered much of the Roman economy. But beyond slavery and the aristocracy, there was an entire middle world. Merchants ran shops in crowded streets. Artisans crafted pottery, tools, jewelry. Bakers operated ovens that supplied daily bread. Teachers instructed children in rhetoric and literature. Doctors practiced medicine. Lawyers argued cases. Contractors built houses and repaired roads. These were free citizens and freed men navigating economic opportunity. Freedmen, formerly enslaved individuals who had been granted freedom, could become remarkably successful. Some amassed significant wealth, particularly in trade and business. Though social stigma lingered, economic mobility was not impossible. Rome had bankers, real estate investors, shipping magnates, bureaucrats managing taxes and records. That does not sound like a society divided strictly between marble palaces and chains. Of course, inequality was severe. The elite controlled immense land holdings and political power. Poverty in crowded urban districts could be harsh and unstable. But the majority of Romans occupied the middle spaces. They paid taxes. They worked trades. They married, raised families, worried about prices in the marketplace. In other words, they lived ordinary lives. We often compress Rome into spectacle, wealth, and brutality because those extremes are dramatic. But what sustained the empire for centuries was not just aristocratic ambition or forced labor. It was the daily routine of millions of people participating in a functioning economy. Civilizations do not endure on spectacle alone. They endure on shopkeepers, builders, teachers, and administrators. Rome was not simply a tale of decadence and oppression. It was also a society of workers navigating a vast and sometimes unforgiving world. And that complexity is far less flashy than marble banquets, but far more accurate. If you imagine ancient Romans walking around sincerely believing that every emperor was a glowing divine being sent directly from the heavens, let's slow that down a bit. The reality is complicated? Yes, emperor worship existed. Yes, some emperors were officially declared divine after death, a process known as apotheosis. Statues were erected, temples were dedicated, coins were minted with divine titles. But that does not mean every Roman citizen genuinely believed the emperor was a walking thunderbolt. Religion in Rome was practical. Ritual mattered more than personal belief. Participation in state ceremonies showed loyalty. Offering incense at an imperial altar was as much political signaling as spiritual conviction. It was civic religion, not blind worship. In fact, the title dis, meaning divine, was usually granted after an emperor's death by the Senate. Augustus, the first emperor, was deified posthumously that created a tradition. But living emperors calling themselves gods, that often caused discomfort. When certain rulers like Caligula or Domitian leaned heavily into divine self-presentation while alive, it raised eyebrows. Some Romans viewed that behavior as arrogant or unstable. There was a difference between honoring the emperor's authority and believing he personally controlled lightning. Also, emperor worship varied by region. In the eastern provinces, ruler cults had already existed under Hellenistic kingdoms. So honoring a living ruler as divine was more culturally familiar. In Rome itself, it was more restrained. Political loyalty and religious symbolism blurred together. Declaring an emperor divine reinforced legitimacy. It unified provinces under a common symbolic authority. It was propaganda as much as piety, and Romans were very good at propaganda. Most citizens likely approached emperor worship pragmatically, participate in rituals, show respect, avoid trouble. Whether they privately believed in literal divinity is another matter. Rome's religious world was layered. People worshipped traditional gods Jupiter, Mars, Venus, alongside local deities and later foreign cults. Adding a deified emperor to the mix was not revolutionary, it was administrative. So no, Rome was not a society of wide-eyed believers worshipping every emperor as a celestial being. It was a society that understood symbolism, power, and public performance. And sometimes the line between religion and politics was intentionally blurry. Not unlike certain eras closer to home, we already dismantled the idea that gladiators died every single fight. Now, let's tackle the next assumption. Every gladiator was a chained, unwilling victim forced into the arena. Many were enslaved. That part is true. Prisoners of war, condemned criminals, and enslaved individuals made up a significant portion of the gladiator population, but not all of them. Some gladiators were volunteers. Yes, volunteers. Free Roman citizens, sometimes even from respectable backgrounds, who signed contracts to fight in the arena. These men were called alarati. They agreed to train and compete for a set period of time, often in exchange for money, debt relief, or the promise of fame, which raises an uncomfortable truth. The arena was not only a place of punishment, it was also a career path, a dangerous one, obviously. But for men buried in debt or chasing recognition, the gladiator life offered something rare: visibility, and Rome loved visibility. Gladiators were celebrities. Their names appeared in graffiti. Women admired them. Children likely played at being their favorite fighters. Winning consistently brought prestige and financial reward. Some even became wealthy. Others earned freedom after years of service, symbolized by receiving a wooden sword called the rudis, a formal retirement. It's also important to remember that gladiator schools were not chaotic torture pits. They were structured institutions with training regimes, diet plans, and medical staff. Again, because trained fighters were valuable investments, that does not make the system humane. The arena was brutal. Injuries were common. Death was always a possibility. But the simplistic image of every gladiator as a helpless victim misses the complexity of Roman society. Some were forced, some were desperate, some were ambitious, and some were drawn by the same force that fills stadiums today, the promise of fame. It's easy to reduce gladiators to a symbol of cruelty. It is harder to acknowledge that some walked into the arena willingly knowing the risks because Rome offered few other ways to transform your status overnight. The arena was not just punishment, it was opportunity. Terrifying opportunity, which somehow makes it even more Roman. If you picture Roman women as permanently silent figures standing in the background of marble halls while men made all the decisions, you're only seeing half the story. Legally speaking, Roman women could not vote. They could not hold political office. They were excluded from formal participation in the Senate or assemblies. On paper, their power was limited. In practice, not so simple. Elite Roman women wielded enormous influence behind the scenes. They managed vast households, controlled significant wealth, arranged marriages that shaped political alliances, and advised powerful men who listened very carefully. Take Livia, the wife of Augustus. She had no official title that gave her governing authority. Yet, ancient sources suggest she influenced court politics for decades. Her network of allies and her proximity to the emperor made her one of the most powerful figures in early imperial Rome. Agrippa the Younger, mother of Nero, maneuvered herself into the center of imperial politics with remarkable precision. Messalina, wife of Claudius, became infamous for her manipulation of court dynamics. Were these women controversial? Absolutely. But controversy does not equal powerlessness. Roman women could own property. They could inherit wealth. Some ran businesses. Wealthy widows in particular had considerable financial independence. Inscriptions and legal documents show women acting as patrons, funding buildings, supporting public works, and sponsoring religious festivals. Even in everyday life, women shaped family strategy. Marriages were political tools. Producing heirs was critical to maintaining status. Social reputation often depended heavily on a woman's management of the household. And remember, influence does not always require a title. Politics in Rome was deeply personal. Networks mattered. Relationships mattered. Access mattered. Women operated within those networks effectively. That does not mean Roman society was equal. It wasn't. But the idea that Roman women were entirely powerless shadows ignores the subtle ways authority functioned in that world. Power in Rome did not always sit in the Senate chamber. Sometimes it stood quietly behind it, and sometimes it whispered in the emperor's ear, which historically speaking can be far more effective than voting. And now we arrive at the grand moral lesson people love to attach to Rome. The empire fell because it became decadent, lazy, corrupt, too obsessed with pleasure, too morally rotten to survive. It's a satisfying explanation, simple, clean, judgmental, and deeply incomplete. Every civilization has corruption. Every society has moral debates. Rome was no exception. There were power struggles, excess among elites, political betrayals, and spectacular scandals. But empires do not collapse simply because someone threw too many dinner parties. The decline of the Western Roman Empire involved complex economic pressures, military overextension, administrative fragmentation, and demographic changes. Border defenses grew harder to maintain. Recruitment became more difficult. Tax systems strained under pressure. Political instability weakened internal cohesion. Competing generals fought civil wars that drained resources. Barbarian groups were sometimes integrated as allies and sometimes turned against the empire when agreements broke down. Trade networks shifted. Inflation rose. Agricultural output fluctuated. Plagues reduced population. This was not a morality play. It was structural stress over centuries. Blaming Rome's fall on decadence alone is convenient because it turns history into a warning story. See, luxury leads to ruin, but reality is less poetic. The Eastern Roman Empire continued for nearly 1,000 years after the West fragmented. If decadence alone destroyed Rome, why did one half survive so long? Because collapse is rarely caused by a single vice. It's usually caused by overlapping pressures that slowly erode stability, and here's the ironic part. Rome endured for centuries precisely because it adapted repeatedly. It restructured its military. It reformed its administration. It extended citizenship. It absorbed foreign influences. The empire did not collapse the first time it faced corruption or luxury. It endured them. So the idea that Rome fell simply because it became morally weak oversimplifies a civilization that lasted longer than most nations ever will. History is not a sermon, it's a web of causes. And Rome's story is far more complicated than a cautionary tale about too much wine and marble. Sometimes the truth is less dramatic, but far more interesting. Before Rome ever called her Augusta, before legions saluted her name, Julia Domna was a child of the East. She was born in the wealthy Syrian city of Asa, a place where desert light met temple gold and where religion and politics are inseparable. Her family were not obscure provincials. They were the hereditary high priests of the sun god El-Gabal, custodians of a sacred black stone believed to hold divine power. Authority, ritual, and influence surrounded her from birth. Unlike many Roman aristocratic girls, raised primarily for marriage alliances, Julia grew up in an intellectually vibrant environment. Syria in the 2nd century was a crossroads of empire, a place where Greek philosophy, Roman administration, and Eastern mysticism blended into something uniquely powerful. She was educated. She listened to scholars. She absorbed rhetoric and argument. She understood how ideas could shape men and how men shaped history. An astrologer once predicted that she would marry a king. In the ancient world, such predictions were not dismissed as harmless superstition, they were political signals. Word of the prophecy reached a rising Roman commander, Septimius Sais. He was ambitious, sharp-minded, and recently widowed. He also happened to believe deeply in omens. When Sais encountered Julia, he saw more than a beautiful Syrian noble woman. He saw poise, intelligence, a presence that did not shrink in conversation. Their marriage was not simply romantic, it was strategic. Around the year 187, Julia left Asa and entered the beating heart of Roman power. Rome was overwhelming. Marble temples towered over crowded streets. Senators whispered in shaded porticos. Generals calculated their next move behind polite smiles. Julia did not retreat into ornamental silence. She watched carefully. She learned the unspoken language of influence. She understood quickly that Rome's stability was an illusion maintained by loyalty to the army. When civil war erupted after the assassination of Emperor Commodus, Severus moved decisively. In the chaos of competing claimants, he marched on Rome and seized power. Julia stood beside him as he claimed the imperial title. The prophecy had ripened into reality. She was no longer merely a priest's daughter from Syria. She was Augusta, empress of Rome, and this was only the beginning. The moment Septimius seized power, Rome did not suddenly become peaceful. It became tense, fragile, dangerous. 3 different men had claimed the throne in the chaos following Commodus's death, and Zeus had defeated them one by one. But victory in Rome was never permanent. It had to be defended constantly. Julia Domna understood this immediately. Unlike earlier empresses, who remained in Rome as decorative symbols of stability, Julia traveled with her husband on campaign. She accompanied him to the eastern provinces when he marched against Peneus Niger. She later endured the cold brutality of the northern frontiers during the Parthian Wars. This was not ceremonial tourism. These were harsh military operations. Disease, mud, exhaustion, and constant threat followed the imperial court. Her presence among the troops was not accidental. Sais needed legitimacy. He was African by birth, ruling a traditionally Italian elite. Julia was Syrian. Together, they represented a new kind of imperial household, one that reflected the broader empire rather than just Rome itself. But that diversity also made traditional senators uneasy. Julia did not allow suspicion to weaken her. She cultivated relationships within the army. Soldiers saw her in their camps. They heard of her intelligence and calm demeanor. Soon she was given a rare and powerful title, Mater Costu, Mother of the Camp. It was more than symbolism. It suggested protection, unity, and continuity in an empire held together by military loyalty. While Sais fought on the battlefield, Julia often managed communication networks, corresponded with officials, and advised on political matters. She understood that wars were won, not only by swords, but by stability at the center. She became a quiet but firm presence in decision-making. In Rome, meanwhile, the Senate watched carefully. A Syrian empress traveling with the army, influencing imperial decisions and commanding respect among generals, was unprecedented. Rumors began as they always did. Some accused her of overstepping. Others whispered about ambition. But Julia had learned something early. Power in Rome was never handed gently. It was navigated carefully, defended strategically, and maintained through intelligence. As Severus consolidated his rule, one thing became clear. This was no passive imperial consort. Julia Domna was not simply standing beside the throne. She was helping to hold it upright as Septimus Severus secured his rule. Julia Domna stepped into a role even more powerful than empress. She became the mother of the future. Her two sons, Caracalla and Gator, were not just children of privilege. They were heirs to an empire held together by force, loyalty, and fear. Julia understood the stakes from an early age. She shaped their education carefully. They were trained in rhetoric, philosophy, and military discipline. Tutors were chosen not merely for knowledge, but for loyalty. She wanted her sons to command respect, not only with swords, but with intellect. Rome had grown tired of foolish emperors. Stability required competence, yet beneath the polished image of unity, tension was growing. Caracalla and Gator were opposites. Caracalla was intense, suspicious, easily angered. He admired Alexander the Great and longed for military glory. Gator was quieter, more measured, more inclined toward administration. Their rivalry did not remain a childhood squabble. It hardened with age. Julia tried to balance them. In public ceremonies, she presented an image of harmony. Coins were minted showing the imperial family together, father, mother, and two heirs. The message was clear: continuity, stability, dynasty. But inside the palace, competition simmered. Size, practical, and ruthless attempted to prepare them both for joint rule. Before his death in Britain in the year 2011, he reportedly advised them to be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men. It was simple advice. It was also impossible. When Size died, Caracalla and Gator became co-emperors. Julia now found herself in an even more precarious position. She was no longer simply supporting a strong husband. She stood between two powerful young men who distrusted each other deeply. The empire watched closely. The army sensed weakness. Julia attempted mediation. She arranged meetings. She encouraged cooperation. She tried to keep Rome from splitting into factions aligned with each brother. But resentment had grown too deep. The palace itself became divided. Servants took sides. Guards whispered. Proposals emerged to physically divide the empire between East and West. For Julia, this was the ultimate test. She had helped build a dynasty. Now she had to prevent it from tearing itself apart, and she was running out of time. The breaking point came not on a battlefield, but inside the imperial palace. After months of bitter tension, Caracalla proposed a reconciliation meeting with his brother Gator. It would take place in their mother's apartments. Neutral ground, no weapons, only family. Julia agreed, believing, perhaps desperately, that maternal presence could cool political hatred. It was a fatal miscalculation. As Gator entered her chambers, assassins loyal to Caracalla rushed in. Steel flashed, panic erupted. Gator ran toward his mother, seeking protection, calling out for help. He was cut down in her arms. Blood spilled across the floor of the empress's private rooms. Julia held her dying son as soldiers finished their work. Caracalla had chosen outpower. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Gator's supporters were hunted down across the empire. Senators, officials, servants, anyone suspected of loyalty to the slain emperor faced execution. Ancient sources speak of thousands killed in the purge. The city of Rome itself trembled under the weight of fear, and Julia remained. Her position was now more complicated than ever. She had lost a son violently at the hands of her other son, yet she could not publicly mourn him. To do so would challenge Caracalla's legitimacy and possibly cost her life. Gator's name was erased from inscriptions. His statues were destroyed. His memory was condemned. Damnio Memoriale, condemnation of memory, turned a living man into an official non-existence. For Julia, this was not political theory. It was personal devastation disguised as composure. Yet she did not withdraw from public life. Instead, she leaned further into governance. Karkala, increasingly paranoid and focused on military campaigns, relied heavily on his mother for administration. She supervised correspondence. She reviewed petitions. She became a stabilizing presence in a court dominated by suspicion. Her strength during this period was extraordinary. She had witnessed fratricide. She had endured the eraser of her son's existence, and still she continued to function as the intellectual and administrative center of the regime. Karkala's rule grew harsher. He granted Roman citizenship broadly through the Constitutio Antoniana, partly to increase tax revenue. He pursued military glory obsessively. He demanded loyalty without question. Behind the scenes, Julia worked constantly to preserve order. The empire had survived civil war. It had survived palace murder. Now it survived on the resilience of a grieving mother who refused to collapse. If the palace had become a place of blood and suspicion, Julia Domna transformed another space into something entirely different, a sanctuary of thought. While Karkala chased military glory across the provinces, obsessed with Alexander the Great and the image of invincible conquest, Julia remained the intellectual axis of the empire. In Rome and later in Antioch, she gathered philosophers, rhetoricians, jurists, and scholars around her. Her court became something rare in a time of fear, a living salon of ideas. This was not casual entertainment, it was deliberate cultural leadership. Among those drawn to her circle was Philostratus, whom she encouraged to write the life of Apollonius of Tyana, a work blending philosophy, mysticism, and political subtlety. She supported jurists whose legal interpretations would shape Roman law for generations. She engaged with thinkers who debated ethics, governance, and the nature of virtue in a crumbling political climate. In a world ruled increasingly by the sword, Julia elevated the mind. Her Eastern background played a role. Raised in Syria, where Greek philosophy mingled easily with religious mysticism, she was comfortable navigating multiple intellectual traditions. She did not see philosophy as detached theory. She saw it as a stabilizing force. Ideas properly cultivated could lend legitimacy to power. Karkala's regime needed that legitimacy. His rule was feared but not universally loved. The massacre following Getter's death had damaged the dynasty's image among elites. Julius' cultivated circle softened that perception. It suggested refinement, learning, continuity with Rome's intellectual heritage. She was in effect reshaping imperial identity. Even as Karkala hardened into suspicion and severity, Julia projected composure and rationality. Petitioners approached her. Governors corresponded with her. Legal matters crossed her desk. She became a bridge between the emperor's will and the empire's administrative reality. Yet, this intellectual brightness existed under constant tension. Karkala trusted few people, conspiracies were real, and some were imagined. Surveillance was constant, fear lingered in corridors. Still, in the midst of that anxiety, Julia's court radiated a final glow of classical Roman culture, a reminder of an empire built not only by legions, but by law, literature, and philosophy. For a brief moment in a violent age, her salon became the last steady flame of reason in a gathering darkness. Karkala's reign grew heavier with each passing year. His obsession with military glory intensified. He styled himself as a new Alexander, imitating Macedonian dress, surrounding himself with soldiers and pushing eastward toward Parthia. The empire became a marching camp. Julia followed. She was no stranger to travel by now. From Britain's cold wines to Syria's desserts, she had seen the edges of Roman power. But this phase felt different. Karkala's rule was not guided by careful consolidation like his father's. It was driven by image, fear, and relentless movement. He trusted the army more than the Senate. He trusted force more than persuasion. Behind the spectacle, Julia worked continuously. She handled administrative burdens while her son chased conquest. Correspondence flowed through her office. Provincial complaints reached her ears. Financial strain grew as campaigns drained the treasury. The Constitutio Antoniana had granted citizenship broadly, but it had also reshaped taxation and bureaucracy. The machinery of empire required constant maintenance. Julia understood something Caracalla did not always acknowledge. Rome was not sustained by dramatic gestures. It was sustained by paperwork, law, and negotiation. Yet even her influence had limits. Caracalla's paranoia deepened. Executions continued. Officers rose and fell with unsettling speed. The emperor's inner circle narrowed to men he believed unconditionally loyal. Among them was the Taurian prefect Macrinus. In the year 217, while traveling near Caria in Mesopotamia, Caracalla stopped along the road. He stepped aside briefly, unguarded for a moment that should have been insignificant. An assassin struck. The emperor fell, killed, not in glorious battle, but in a sudden and ordinary betrayal. The army reacted quickly. Macrinus maneuvered swiftly and declared himself emperor. He had not been born to imperial blood. He was an equestrian, an administrator, now elevated by opportunity and necessity. Julia at that moment in Antioch received the news. Her last surviving son was dead. The dynasty she had built was shattered. The severed line appeared finished. But even then, she did not immediately surrender to despair. Macrinus understood her influence. The Eastern legions respected her. The administrative elite knew her competence. He could not simply eliminate her without risking instability. For the first time in decades, Julia stood at the edge of power without a son or husband to anchor her position. The empire had entered a new uncertainty, and she had to decide whether to fight for relevance or let history close around her. Caracalla's death did not immediately remove Julia from influence. In fact, for a brief moment, she remained indispensable. Macrinus, now emperor, lacked legitimacy. He was not of senatorial rank, not of imperial blood, and not beloved by the army. He needed stability in the East, and Julia Domna was the embodiment of that stability. For years, she had governed from Antioch while campaigns raged. Governors respected her. Soldiers recognized her presence. Even rivals understood her political intelligence. Macrinus initially treated her with caution rather than hostility. He allowed her to remain in Antioch and even continue certain administrative functions. But the balance was fragile. Julia had no living son to defend. Her authority rested entirely on reputation, and reputation is powerful until it becomes threatening. Macrinus soon realized that as long as Julia lived and commanded loyalty in the eastern provinces, she represented a potential center of opposition. The Syrian dynasty still had supporters. Whispers traveled through military camps. The idea of restoring Severan blood to the throne was not unthinkable. Julia herself was not naive. She understood the shift immediately. The tone of correspondence changed. Access narrowed. Influence diminished. She had spent decades navigating civil wars, assassinations, and palace intrigue. She could read political temperature like a seasoned general reads a battlefield. At the same time, her body was failing her. Ancient sources suggest she suffered from illness, possibly cancer. Years of stress, travel, and emotional trauma had taken their toll. She had endured the murder of one son by another. She had watched the second son grow into tyranny and then die violently. She had held the empire together while it cracked beneath ambition and fear. Now she faced a final humiliation, irrelevance. Macrinus eventually ordered her to leave Antioch and return to Rome. It was framed as protocol, but the message was clear. She was no longer necessary. She was no longer central. For a woman who had once been Marta Castrum, mother of the camp, intellectual patron of the empire, and political strategist at the highest level, this dismissal was not simply political, it was existential. Julia Domna had built her life around power, stability, and dynasty. Without those, she was left with only memory. And in Rome, memory could be as dangerous as ambition. When Julia Domna understood that her political life was over, she did not collapse in panic. She calculated. Macrinus had stripped her of influence and ordered her return to Rome. The journey itself would have been symbolic, a public demotion from imperial architect to sidelined widow. She had spent decades shaping emperors and advising generals. To be paraded back as a relic of a fallen dynasty was a humiliation she would not accept. At the same time, her health was deteriorating rapidly. Ancient accounts suggest she was suffering from a severe illness, possibly cancer. The pain was constant. The body that had traveled with armies across deserts and frozen frontiers was now failing. Julia had lived her life with agency. She had crossed from Syria to Rome by choice. She had embraced political power deliberately. She had remained in the palace after her son murdered his brother. She had governed during campaigns. She had curated an intellectual revival in an age of suspicion. She would not let her final chapter be written by someone else. In the year 217 in Antioch, she chose to end her life. Some sources suggest she refused food. Others imply a more direct method. The details are uncertain. The intention is not. Her death was not theatrical. It was controlled. It was consistent with the Roman ideal of dignitas, the preservation of personal honor, even in defeat. In a world where emperors were often butchered by their own guards, Julia chose something quieter. Macrinus allowed her body to be returned to Rome. Eventually, her remains were placed in the mausoleum of Hadrian alongside members of the Sever family. Even her enemies understood her stature, but history did not close immediately around her legacy. In the East, her sister Julius would soon rally support for her grandson, a teenage priest of Elagabal from Amazer. Within a year, Macrinus would be overthrown. The Severan bloodline would briefly reclaim the throne through Elagabalus and later Severus Alexander. Even in death, Julia's network endured. She had entered Rome as a provincial bride guided by prophecy. She left as one of the most intellectually formidable empresses in imperial history. A woman who had navigated civil war, fratricide, tyranny, and political collapse without surrendering her composure. Her body failed, her dynasty fractured, but her will remained unmistakably her own. After her death, Rome did not immediately recognize what it had lost. Julia Domna had never ruled in her own name, never commanded legions directly, never officially signed laws as sovereign. Yet for decades, she had been the connective tissue of an empire stretched thin by ambition and violence. Without her steady presence, the intellectual and administrative coherence she cultivated began to fade. Her sister Julia Mesa would soon maneuver her grandson, the future Elagabalus, onto the throne, restoring Severan blood to power. But that restoration was unstable, theatrical, and controversial. The philosophical seriousness that had marked Julia's salon did not return with the same force. The empire would increasingly tilt towards spectacle and instability. What made Julia unique was not simply her survival in a brutal political world. It was her ability to combine power with intellect. In her court gathered jurists who refined Roman law in ways that would influence legal systems for centuries. Philosophers debated ethics and governance under her patronage. Writers shaped narratives that attempted to reconcile imperial authority with moral order. In an age drifting toward militarized rule, she insisted that ideas still mattered. That insistence was rare. Roman imperial history is filled with strong women. Agrena, Livia, Misolina, often remembered for manipulation or scandal. Julia Domna's reputation, by contrast, rests on something quieter, but arguably more profound. Intellectual leadership. She bridged worlds. Born in Syria, educated in Greek thought, ruling in Rome, she embodied the empire's diversity at its height. Her very presence challenged the idea that Rome belonged only to Italy. Under the Severs, the empire became visibly global. Julia was at the center of that transformation. Yet her life was also a study in cost. She lost one son to murder in her own chambers. She watched another descend into paranoia and violence. She endured civil war, political suspicion, and physical illness. She navigated male-dominated structures without ever publicly rebelling against them, instead mastering them from within. In the end, her salon truly became one of the last great gatherings of classical Roman intellect before the 3rd century crisis deepened and the empire's structure began to fracture more permanently. Julia Domna did not save Rome forever, but for a generation through strategy, composure, and thought. She held its fragile world together and proved that power guided by intellect could still shape history. Before martial arts had names, they had bruises. Long before the Jews, temples, or training halls echoed with ritual bows, human beings were learning how to survive with their hands. The earliest forms of combat were not systems, they were instincts sharpened by fear. A strike to the throat, a grip on the wrist, a shove to the ground. These were not techniques written in manuals, they were discoveries made in chaos. But as small tribes became organized societies, something subtle began to change. Fighting was no longer only about individual survival. It became collective. Armies formed, borders emerged. Authority needed protection, and raw aggression was no longer enough. Efficiency mattered. A wild swing wastes energy. A controlled strike conserves it. Ancient civilizations quickly realized that combat could be refined. Movements could be practiced repeatedly. Balance could be improved. Strength could be directed instead of scattered. Over time, what began as instinct evolved into structure. In early India, warriors trained not only in weapon use, but in disciplined body control. In ancient China, soldiers drilled formations and techniques that demanded coordination and breath control. In Greece, athletic training merged seamlessly with combat practice, blurring the line between sport and war. Across cultures separated by geography and language, one idea kept resurfacing. Skill in combat could be cultivated deliberately, but here is the deeper transformation. At some point, fighting stopped being only physical. It became moral, spiritual, philosophical. Warriors began to believe that discipline of the body required discipline of the mind. Strength without control was dangerous. Power without restraint threatened order. So combat training became ritualized. Teachers passed down not just movements, but codes of conduct. Courage, honor, self-mastery. The battlefield had shaped the body. Now society was shaping the warrior. What we now call martial arts did not appear fully formed. They grew slowly from necessity into tradition, from tradition into identity, and from identity into philosophy. Across early civilizations, combat stopped being simply about defeating an opponent. It became a way to defeat oneself, fear, anger, hesitation before facing anyone else. That transformation would define martial arts for centuries to come. If we trace the earliest structured martial traditions, one of the oldest surviving systems leads us to southern India to a discipline known as Kalarippayattu. Developed in the region of Kerala, Kalarippayattu was more than a method of fighting. It was a complete training system that blended combat, medicine, spirituality, and physical mastery into one unified practice. The training hall known as the Kalari was treated as sacred ground. Students entered barefoot. They saluted the earth. They honored their teacher. This was not casual sparring. It was ritual. Legends connect Kalarippayattu to ancient warrior clans and even to mythic heroes. Some traditions claim that the sage Parasurama, an avatar of Vishnu, created the art to train warriors after reclaiming the land from the sea. Whether myth or memory, the message is clear. Combat was woven into cosmic order. Training began with body conditioning. Students learned flexibility, balance, and controlled breathing before ever touching a weapon. Their movements were animal-inspired, low stances like a tiger, coiled readiness like a serpent, explosive leaps like a lion. These postures were not decorative, they built coordination and adaptability. Only after mastering the body did students advance to weapons. Wooden sticks came first, then metal blades, spears, and shields. Each weapon required precision and timing. A single mistake could be fatal. The discipline demanded calm under pressure. But Kalarippayattu contained something even more unique. Knowledge of vital points. Ancient Indian texts described mama points, sensitive areas of the body where strikes could disable or kill. These same points were used in healing practices within Ayurveda. The warrior therefore learned both how to harm and how to heal. Violence and restoration existed side by side. This duality shaped the philosophy of Indian martial practice. Combat was powerful, but it required restraint. A true warrior was not reckless, he was controlled. Over time, India's martial traditions influenced neighboring regions. Trade routes carried not only spices and textiles, but ideas. Some historians even suggest that elements of Indian combat systems traveled eastward toward China through monks and merchants. Whether directly connected or independently evolved, one truth stands firm. In ancient India, martial training became something greater than battlefield preparation. It became discipline, devotion, and a sacred art of the body. If India refined combat into sacred discipline, China transformed it into a living philosophy. The origins of what we now call kung fu are layered in legend and history. Some traditions speak of an Indian monk named Bodhidharma who traveled to China and arrived at the Shaolin temple during the 6th century. According to later stories, he found the monks physically weak from long hours of meditation and introduced exercises to strengthen their bodies. Whether this account is literal or symbolic, it captures something essential. In China, martial training fused with spiritual cultivation. At the Shaolin temple, combat techniques were practiced alongside Buddhist meditation. Movement and stillness were not opposites. They were partners. A punch required focus. A block required breath control. Discipline of the body supported discipline of the mind. But kung fu did not begin only in monasteries. Long before Shaolin rose to prominence, Chinese soldiers trained in organized combat systems. Ancient military manuals describe spear formations, archery drills, and unarmed techniques. During the Warring States period, combat skill was not optional. It was survival in an era of constant conflict. Over time, these battlefield methods evolved. Techniques were refined into forms, choreographed sequences of movement that preserved strategy and timing. These forms allowed knowledge to be passed down even in peaceful periods. A student could rehearse combat without actual war. Philosophy shaped the art deeply. Taoist principles influenced fluid, circular movements that emphasized yielding rather than resisting. Confucian ideals stressed hierarchy and respect between master and student. Buddhism introduced self-control and detachment from ego. This blend created something distinct. Kung Fu was not simply about overpowering an opponent. It was about harmony, redirecting force instead of meeting it hidden, controlling anger instead of being consumed by it. Weapons training remained central. Staffs, swords, spears, and hook blades demanded precision and grace. But even unarmed practice required discipline equal to armed combat. Every strike carried intention. Every stance grounded the practitioner. As centuries passed, regional styles emerged. Northern systems emphasized wide extended movements. Southern styles favored compact power. Each reflected geography, culture, and local needs. Yet at its core, Chinese martial tradition carried one consistent message. Strength must be balanced by wisdom. In the training hall, as in life, mastery began within. While monks trained in temples and warriors drilled in sacred courtyards, ancient Greece approached combat from another angle, the arena. The Greeks did not separate athletics from warfare. To them, a strong body was a civic virtue. A disciplined fighter was a valuable citizen. Physical excellence was not vanity, it was preparation. Among the most brutal and revered combat disciplines of the ancient world was Pankration. Its name literally meant all power. Introduced into the Olympic Games in 648 BCE, Pankration blended wrestling and boxing into a near unrestricted contest. Strikes, joint locks, chokes, throws, almost anything was allowed. There were few rules. No weight classes, no time limits. Victory came through submission or unconsciousness. But Pankration was not chaos, it demanded technique. Fighters trained to control balance, conserve energy, and exploit weakness. A poorly timed attack could leave you exposed. A moment of hesitation could cost you consciousness. Greek city-states valued this discipline because it mirrored warfare. Hoplites fought in close quarters with shields and spears. But once formations broke, combat turned personal. Grappling skill and endurance mattered. Yet there was also philosophy in Greek combat culture. The concept of merit, excellence in mind and body, shaped athletic training. The gymnasium was not merely a workout space, it was a place of education. Young men trained physically while also studying rhetoric and philosophy. Strength and intellect were cultivated together. Even Plato wrote about the importance of balancing gymnastics and music, meaning physical training and intellectual refinement. Too much aggression without education created brutality. Too much study without strength created weakness. Pankration embodied this balance. It was savage, but it was also structured. Competitors were admired not only for victory but for endurance and courage. To stand your ground in the arena was proof of character. Greek martial practice did not carry the overt spirituality of India or China. Instead, it was civic, public, celebrated. Combat was spectacle, but it was also preparation. In Greece, fighting became a test of identity. Not just whether you could defeat your opponent, but whether you could master yourself under pressure in front of an entire city watching. The body became a stage for discipline, and the arena became a school for warriors. If Greece turned combat into public spectacle, Rome turned it into machinery. The Roman Empire did not romanticize fighting. It systematized it. For Rome, combat was not about individual glory. It was about efficiency, coordination, and relentless discipline. The legion was not a gathering of heroes, it was a living engine of war. Training in the Roman army was constant and unforgiving. Recruits drilled daily with wooden swords heavier than real ones. Shields were oversized in practice to build endurance. Marches stretched for miles under full equipment. Soldiers learned to thrust, not slash. A stab was quicker, more lethal, less likely to expose the body. Every movement had purpose. Unlike the philosophical blending of body and spirit seen in India or China, Roman martial culture emphasized order above all. A soldier's strength meant nothing if he broke formation. Individual skill was secondary to collective cohesion. The two-do formation, where shields locked overhead and in front turned men into a single armored creature. This was combat as engineering. Yet even Rome absorbed older traditions. Gladiatorial schools trained fighters in specialized techniques drawn from various cultures. Thracian, Samnite, Gaulish, though gladiators fought for spectacle, their methods were technical and precise. Weapon pairing, footwork, and psychological intimidation all mattered. Outside the arena, Roman military manuals documented training methods. Discipline was enforced with harsh penalties. Cowardice was punished severely. Loyalty was non-negotiable. But something deeper existed beneath this rigidity. The Roman concept of virtues, manly courage, and moral strength shaped military identity. A soldier was expected not only to fight well, but to embody honor and endurance. Combat was proof of character. As the empire expanded, Roman martial systems spread across Europe and the Mediterranean. Local populations adopted Roman drilling techniques. Fortifications and training camps standardized warfare across vast territories. In Rome, martial discipline became the backbone of empire. It was not mystical, it was practical. But it carried a powerful cultural message: order conquers chaos. And that idea would influence Western combat traditions for centuries. From legion drills to gladiatorial schools, Rome demonstrated that fighting could be industrialized, refined, and exported. The sword was no longer just a weapon, it was a tool of empire. While Rome perfected formation warfare and China refined fluid philosophy, Japan developed something that fused combat with an unshakable code of honor. Early Japanese martial traditions grew out of battlefield necessity. During the Han and Kamakura periods, mounted archers dominated warfare. The samurai emerged not as mythical swordsmen at first, but as skilled cavalry warriors trained in archery, spear combat, and tactical coordination. But as warfare evolved, so did their training. By the medieval period, swordsmanship, kyutsu became central. Schools formed around specific techniques. Masters passed down lineages of knowledge. Each movement was precise, efficient, and deadly. A single strike was meant to end a fight. Yet, Japanese martial development did not stop at battlefield utility. Zen Buddhism deeply influenced samurai training. Meditation sharpened awareness. The concept of mushin, or no mind, taught warriors to act without hesitation or emotional interference. Overthinking meant death. Clarity meant survival. This blending of combat and spirituality gave rise to something distinct: Bushido, the way of the warrior. It emphasized loyalty, discipline, self-control, and acceptance of death. The samurai trained not only to win, but to die honorably if necessary. Training halls were austere. Practice was repetitive. A cut was performed thousands of times until it became instinctive. Sparring was controlled but intense. Wooden swords, then sharpened steel. Precision was sacred. Other arts emerged alongside swordsmanship. Jiu-jitsu developed as a grappling system designed for situations where armor made striking ineffective. Joint locks, throws, and chokes allowed a warrior to neutralize an opponent even without a weapon. Later, these techniques would influence modern judo and other grappling arts. Japanese martial culture placed immense value on discipline. Rank was earned through dedication. Technique was inseparable from character. By the time relative peace settled during the Tokugawa period, martial arts transformed further. Without constant warfare, training shifted from survival toward refinement and self-improvement. Combat became a path of personal cultivation. In Japan, fighting evolved into a lifelong study of precision and restraint. The blade was sharp, but the mind had to be sharper. While Asia and Europe developed codified martial traditions, the civilizations of Mesoamerica shaped combat into something deeply ritualistic. Among the Maya and later the Aztecs, warfare was not only about territorial expansion. It was spiritual obligation. Victory fed the gods. Captives sustained cosmic balance. Combat, therefore, carried sacred weight. Aztec warriors trained from youth in karmic and Telpakali schools. Young boys learned discipline, endurance, and weapon use. The Makua whittle, a wooden club embedded with razor-sharp obsidian blades, became one of their most feared weapons. Spears, atals, and shields completed the arsenal, but unlike Roman or Greek systems that prioritized killing efficiency, Mesoamerican combat often emphasized capture. Warriors gained prestige not simply by defeating enemies, but by taking them alive. Captives were destined for ritual sacrifice. This changed technique dramatically. Strikes were aimed to disable rather than instantly kill. Grappling and coordination mattered as much as raw force. The so-called flower wars between city-states were sometimes prearranged conflicts designed to secure prisoners for religious ceremonies. To modernize, this may seem brutal, but within their worldview, it was structured necessity. The sun required nourishment, the cosmos required blood. Warrior societies formed elite ranks. Eagle and jaguar warriors wore elaborate costumes symbolizing power and divine connection. Advancement came through courage and success in battle. Combat skill was directly tied to social mobility. Physical training was rigorous. Marches, weapon drills, and endurance exercises hardened young recruits. Discipline was enforced strictly. Cowardice could result in severe punishment. Yet, spirituality infused everything. Warriors prayed before battle. They invoked deities associated with war and sacrifice. Combat was not random violence, it was part of cosmic order. In this sense, Mesoamerican martial culture mirrored patterns seen elsewhere. Fighting became ritual, it shaped identity, it reinforced hierarchy. It connected the physical world with the spiritual one. Across continents, civilizations independently reached similar conclusions. Combat was never just about defeating another human being. it was about meaning. In Mesoamerica, that meaning was carved in obsidian and sealed in ceremony. A reminder that martial tradition could bind an entire society to its gods. As centuries passed and empires rose and fell, something remarkable happened across multiple cultures at once. Combat began to leave the battlefield. Periods of relative peace forced martial traditions to adapt. Warriors who once trained for constant war now found themselves without campaigns. Yet the techniques did not disappear, they evolved. In China, during more stable dynasties, martial systems became increasingly tied to internal cultivation. Practices like Tai Chi emerged, emphasizing slow, controlled movements rooted in balance and breath. What once may have had direct combat application transformed into a path of health, longevity, and mental clarity. In Japan, the shift from kenjutsu, practical sword combat, to kendo, the way of the sword, marked a similar transformation. The suffix "du" meant path. It signaled that martial practice was no longer solely about defeating an opponent. It was about self-perfection. In India, warrior traditions that once prepared fighters for regional conflicts were preserved within training lineages, temple schools, and cultural festivals. Techniques remained, but their meaning expanded beyond war. Even in the West, medieval European combat schools that trained knights for armored duels later became structured fencing systems emphasizing form, timing, and sportsmanship. The body still moved with intention, but the goal shifted inward. Martial training became a means of shaping character. Discipline built resilience. Repetition cultivated patience. Sparring taught humility. Students vowed not to glorify violence, but to acknowledge responsibility. The paradox deepened. The better one became at fighting, the less one sought to use it recklessly. Philosophies across cultures reinforced this idea. Taoist thought encouraged harmony over aggression. Zen emphasized clarity without attachment. Bushido demanded moral restraint. Even Western chivalry codes insisted on honor in combat. Across continents, martial arts began carrying similar messages. Strength must be governed by wisdom. Power must serve order, not ego. What began as raw survival had matured into ritualized self-discipline. The battlefield forged the techniques. Peace refined them into philosophy. By this stage, martial arts were no longer simply preparation for war. They were systems of personal development. Schools, lineages, and codes ensured continuity. Combat had become culture, and culture would carry it into the modern world. By the time the modern era dawned, martial arts had already traveled far beyond their original landscapes. Trade routes, migration, conquest, and cultural exchange carried techniques across continents. Ideas blended, styles adapted. What began as regionally distinct traditions slowly became global languages of movement. When Okinawan practitioners developed karate under the influence of Chinese systems, they preserved both striking techniques and philosophical discipline. When Japanese jiu-jitsu evolved into judo under Jigurano, combat efficiency was reshaped into structured sport and moral education. The emphasis shifted from battlefield survival to character formation. In China, martial traditions endured political upheaval and modernization. Some schools emphasized performance and cultural preservation, others maintained combat practicality. Yet, even when adapted for demonstration or sport, the underlying principles remained rooted in centuries-old philosophy. Western societies reinterpreted their combat traditions. Boxing, wrestling, and fencing became organized sports with formal rules and competitions. Though stripped of lethal intent, they retained the core values of discipline, endurance, and respect. In the 20th century, global exposure accelerated. Soldiers stationed abroad brought techniques home. Teachers immigrated. Films and demonstrations captured imaginations. Martial arts became not only methods of self-defense, but symbols of identity and resilience. Yet beneath the globalization and commercialization, the ancient pattern remained intact. Every culture that developed martial systems had faced the same challenge: how to control violence without being consumed by it, how to train the body without neglecting the mind, how to cultivate strength while preserving restraint. The answers varied in style, but not in spirit, from the Kalari training halls of India to the Shaolin courtyards of China, from the Greek arena to the Roman legion camp, from samurai dojus to Mesoamerican warrior schools. One theme endured: combat was never purely physical. It was ritual, it was discipline, it was worldview. Martial arts survived because they evolved. They shifted from survival tools to philosophical paths. They became vehicles for teaching courage, patience, humility, and self-mastery. What began as instinct in the earliest human conflicts became one of humanity's most refined cultural expressions, not because people loved violence, but because they sought to understand it and ultimately to rise above it. In ancient Egypt, cosmetics were not optional, they were essential. Long before modern beauty industries, Egyptians had already transformed daily grooming into a ritual that blended aesthetics, medicine, and spirituality. The most iconic symbol of this tradition was kohl, the dark eyeliner that framed the eyes of both men and women across social classes. From pharaohs to laborers, kohl was part of everyday life. But this was not simple decoration. The Egyptian world was filled with unseen forces. Illness, misfortune, and spiritual attack were believed to travel invisibly through the air. The eyes, seen as powerful yet vulnerable, required protection. Lining them with black or green pigment was thought to guard against the evil eye and invoke divine protection from gods, such as Horus. The elongated almond shape depicted in tomb paintings was both fashion and faith. The ingredients themselves tell a deeper story. Kohl was often made from ground galena, a lead-based mineral, or from malachite, a green copper ore, mixed with animal fat or plant oils. The powder was applied with carefully carved sticks of wood, bone, or ivory. These tools were stored in decorative containers, some shaped like small statues or engraved with religious symbols. Cosmetics also served practical functions. The intense Egyptian sun reflected harshly off sand and stone. The dark pigment around the eyes reduced glare, much like modern athletes use eye black today. Some chemical compounds in the makeup may have even stimulated the immune system or helped to prevent eye infections in a region where dust and insects were constant threats. Skin care mattered just as much as eye makeup. Oils made from moringa, sesame, or castor were used to moisturize the skin. Perfumed unwants blended animal fats with aromatic resins such as myrrh and frankincense. During banquets, wealthy guests wore cones of scented wax atop their wigs. As the wax melted in the heat, fragrance slowly flowed over their hair and shoulders. Class distinctions were visible in materials. The wealthy used finely ground minerals and elaborate containers. The poor relied on simpler mixtures. Yet the act itself, the ritual of application, was shared across society. In Egypt, beauty was not superficial. It was protection, it was health, it was identity. And in a land where eternity mattered more than youth, cosmetics were carefully packed into tombs, ready for use in the afterlife. While Egypt perfected dramatic eyeliner and perfumed rituals along the Nile, another civilization was experimenting with beauty between the rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates. In ancient Mesopotamia, home to Sumerians, Assyrians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, cosmetics were closely tied to status and urban identity. These were some of the earliest city builders in human history. With cities came visibility, with visibility came appearance. Archaeological discoveries reveal small cosmetic containers, carved applicators, and pigment traces dating back thousands of years. Both men and women enhanced their eyes with dark pigments similar to kohl. The eyes were again central, expressive, symbolic, and powerful. But Mesopotamian beauty extended beyond eyeliner. Elite women colored their lips and cheeks using crushed gemstones and mineral-based pigments. Red tones were particularly valued. They signaled vitality and desirability. The ingredients were sometimes expensive and imported, which meant cosmetics quickly became a marker of wealth. Hair also carried deep cultural meaning. Thick dark hair was admired. Oils were applied to give shine and manageability in the hot climate. Elaborate braids and curled styles were common among the upper classes. Men, particularly rulers and priests, cultivated carefully groomed beards, often curled into symmetrical patterns. Grooming was not vanity. It reflected order, power, and civilization. Fragrance played a major role in Mesopotamian life. Perfume making developed early in the region. Aromatic plants were distilled or infused into oils. Records suggest that skilled perfumers worked within temple complexes, blending scents for both ritual and personal use. Smell, like sight, carried spiritual weight. Pleasant fragrance was associated with divine favor. Beauty was also tied to law and morality. Ancient legal codes mention appearance indirectly, particularly in cases of adultery, marriage contracts, and social conduct. Presentation could influence reputation. Reputation influenced survival in tightly structured city-states. Yet, just as in Egypt, cosmetics were not purely aesthetic. The harsh climate demanded skin protection. Oils prevented cracking and dryness. Pigments may have provided mild shielding from sunlight. Mesopotamia demonstrates something crucial about ancient cosmetics. Beauty evolved wherever urban life intensified. As societies grew more complex, so did the language of appearance. Cosmetics became tools of identity. They communicated class, devotion, and social standing in crowded streets and temple courts. Long before mirrors of polished bronze reflected painted faces, beauty was already shaping civilization itself. As civilizations matured around the Mediterranean, ancient Greece introduced a different philosophy of beauty, one that prized balance, moderation, and the illusion of effortlessness. Unlike the bold eyeliner of Egypt or the gemstone pigments of Mesopotamia, Greek cosmetics often aimed to enhance rather than transform. The Greek ideal celebrated harmony of proportions. Beauty was seen as a reflection of inner virtue. To appear excessive or overly adorned could suggest vanity or moral weakness. Yet this did not mean Greeks avoided cosmetics. Women, especially among the upper classes, lightened their skin deliberately. Pale skin signaled status. It meant you did not labor outdoors. White lead and chalk base powders were applied to the face to create a luminous complexion. Unfortunately, these substances were toxic, a reminder that beauty has always carried risk. To add color, women used crushed berries or red ochre to tint lips and cheeks. The effect was meant to look subtle, almost accidental. A healthy flush suggested youth and vitality, qualities highly valued in marriage markets. Eyes were also defined, though less dramatically than in Egypt. Soot and charcoal were used sparingly to darken lashes or brows. Eyebrows themselves were carefully shaped. In some cases, a unibrow was considered attractive, symbolizing intelligence and purity. When nature did not cooperate, cosmetic tricks filled the gap. Hair was another central feature. Golden or light hair was admired, partly influenced by mythological depictions of gods and heroes. Some women used plant-based lightening agents to achieve a brighter tone. Hairstyles were intricate, often braided and pinned, reflecting both fashion and social role. Perfume carried cultural weight as well. Greek society valued fragrance, a sign of refinement. Oils infused with herbs, flowers, and resins were applied after bathing. However, philosophers sometimes criticized excessive scent as indulgent. Even beauty had to remain within reason. This tension between adornment and moderation defined Greek cosmetic culture. Beauty was expected, but restraint was admired. What stands out most is the connection between aesthetics and ethics. For the Greeks, the body was a canvas of character. To care for one's appearance was acceptable, even expected, but it had to align with the broader ideal of balance. Cosmetics in Greece were not bold statements. They were careful whispers, subtle adjustments meant to reflect harmony, youth, and controlled elegance in a society obsessed with proportion. If the Greeks preferred subtlety, the Romans embraced transformation. Ancient Rome inherited cosmetic traditions from both Greece and Egypt, but amplified them. As the empire expanded, luxury goods flowed into the city from across the Mediterranean and beyond. With wealth came extravagance, and cosmetics became more elaborate, more visible, and more controversial. Roman women of the upper classes invested significant time in daily beauty routines. Pale skin remained fashionable, signaling leisure and status. White lead and chalk powders were applied generously to create a porcelain-like complexion. The irony, of course, was that prolonged use damaged the skin, sometimes causing discoloration or illness, which then require even more cosmetic correction. Rouge made from red ochre or crushed mulberries added color to cheeks. Lips were tinted using plant dyes or mineral pigments. Eyes were darkened with soot or imported coal. Eyebrows were shaped carefully and in some cases enhanced artificially. But Roman cosmetics were not limited to the face. Skin creams and lotions were widely used. Recipes survive in ancient texts describing mixtures of honey, milk, animal fat, barley flour, and even crocodile dung. These were believed to soften skin, remove blemishes, or reduce wrinkles. Beauty was not just decorative, it was maintenance. Perfume became a full industry in Rome. Fragrances were imported from Arabia, Egypt, and India. Oils scented with rose, myrrh, cinnamon, and saffron were stored in delicate glass containers. A wealthy Roman might apply scent to hair, skin, clothing, and even furniture. Excess was common. Yet, Roman society held a complicated attitude toward cosmetics. Moralists like Seneca and Juvenal criticized women who wore heavy makeup, suggesting it hid true character. Excessive adornment was often associated with vanity or moral decay. At the same time, public expectation demanded polished appearance. A woman of status was expected to look refined. Cosmetics therefore became a performance of class. Wealthy women had personal attendants, cosmeti, who applied products, styled hair, and prepared elaborate looks. Enslaved workers often specialized in these tasks. In Rome, beauty was both personal and political. To appear well-groomed signaled power, discipline, and prosperity. To appear neglected suggested decline. As the empire grew more complex, cosmetics mirrored its contradictions. Luxury and decay, elegance and excess, admiration and criticism. In Roman society, beauty was no longer quiet, it was spectacle. While Rome turned cosmetics into spectacle, ancient China shaped them into symbolism. Beauty in early Chinese dynasties was deeply connected to cultural ideals of harmony, refinement, and social order. Appearance was not simply personal preference. It reflected one's place within the broader moral and cosmic structure. Pale skin once again signaled status. In agrarian societies, darker skin implied labor under the sun. Aristocratic women used rice powder and finely ground minerals to lighten the face. The goal was smoothness and delicacy, skin like porcelain. During the Tang Dynasty in particular, cosmetics reached striking levels of creativity. Women applied vibrant rouge high on the cheeks, sometimes blending into the temples. Lips were painted in carefully shaped patterns, small petal-like forms rather than fully colored mouths. Eyebrows were drawn thin, arched, or even shaped into unusual curves depending on fashion trends. One distinctive practice was the application of wadian, small decorative marks placed on the forehead. These could be made of gold leaf, colored paper, or pigment shaped into flowers or abstract symbols. They were delicate yet intentional, adding visual rhythm to the face. But Chinese cosmetics carried layers of meaning. Confucian values emphasized modesty and propriety, especially for women of noble households. While beauty was appreciated, it had to align with virtue. Excessive adornment could be interpreted as moral weakness. Therefore, refinement and balance were key. Fragrance also played a central role. Incense culture flourished in imperial courts. Hair was perfumed, garments were scented, and rooms were filled with aromatic smoke. Smell like sight shaped social perception. Hairstyling itself was an art. Elaborate updo adorned with pins and combs reflected marital status and rank. In some periods, Long flowing hair symbolized femininity and vitality. Cosmetics were not limited to women. Men in certain dynasties also used powder lightly, particularly within court circles where presentation reflected sophistication. Medical texts reveal that beauty and health were intertwined. Herbal formulas were created to brighten complexion, strengthen hair, and maintain youthful appearance. External beauty was believed to reflect internal balance. In China, cosmetics were less about dramatic transformation and more about symbolic harmony. Each brush stroke carried intention. Each color suggested refinement. Beauty was not rebellion. It was alignment with culture, with status, and with the invisible balance believed to govern the universe itself. In ancient India, cosmetics were never just about appearance. They were expressions of devotion, identity, and sacred symbolism woven directly into daily life. Long before commercial beauty products, Indian traditions incorporated natural ingredients drawn from plants, minerals, and spices. Turmeric was used to brighten skin and purify it. Sandalwood paste cooled the body in hot climates and left a soft fragrance. Henna stained hands and feet with intricate reddish patterns, especially during weddings and festivals. One of the most recognizable features was Kyle, a dark eyeliner similar to kohl, applied to both adults and children. Kyle was believed to protect against the evil eye. A small dot placed on the cheek of a child could ward off jealousy or spiritual harm. Beauty and protection were inseparable. The forehead became a canvas of meaning. The bindi, traditionally a red dot applied between the eyebrows, symbolized spiritual insight and marital status. In Hindu belief, this area marked the Ajna chakra, the center of intuition. What may appear decorative today once carried layered spiritual significance. Hair held sacred importance. Long, well-maintained hair symbolized vitality and femininity. Oils made from coconut, sesame, or amla were massaged into the scalp to strengthen strands and promote shine. Fragrant flowers were often woven into braids during ceremonies. Ancient texts such as the Karma and the Vedic writings described beauty routines in detail. These manuals included recipes for skin cleansers made of lentils and herbs, tooth powders for oral care, and scented pastes for body application. Beauty was closely tied to health and balance within the body. Jewelry also functioned as cosmetic enhancement. Nose rings, anklets, and bangles were not merely ornaments. They signaled marital status, region, and social identity. Adornment formed a complete visual language. Class distinctions were visible in materials. Royal courts had access to rare perfumes and finely ground minerals. Rural communities relied on local herbs and plant-based dyes. Yet across social levels, the act of adornment was woven into ritual life. In India, cosmetics became a bridge between the physical and the spiritual. Applying kyle was protection, wearing henna was blessing. Painting the forehead was alignment with divine energy. Beauty was not separate from belief, it was devotion made visible. Between the great empires of Egypt, Rome, and Persia lay a region where cosmetics took on a different emphasis. Scent. In the ancient Levant and Arabian Peninsula, fragrance was not simply pleasant, it was sacred currency. Trade routes crossing deserts and seas carried frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, and exotic resins from Arabia into Mediterranean markets. These materials were worth extraordinary sums. To possess them was to hold status. Perfume was cosmetic and ritual at once. In temple ceremonies, incense smoke rose toward the heavens as offerings to deities. In private homes, scented oils were applied to skin and hair after bathing. The act of anointing symbolized purification, hospitality, and divine favor. A guest welcomed with fragrance was a guest honored. Both men and women used perfumed oils. Unlike some cultures where cosmetics were primarily associated with women, scent in the Levantine world was gender neutral. Warriors, merchants, and rulers alike valued fragrance, a marker of refinement. Eye cosmetics were also present. Kohl spread widely through trade networks. Applied around the eyes, it reduced glare from harsh sunlight and protected against infections. As in Egypt and India, It also carried spiritual symbolism believed to shield against harmful forces. Skin care routines relied heavily on oils. Olive oil was central, abundant, nourishing, and versatile. It softened skin, cleaned the body when mixed with scraping tools, and served as a base for infused perfumes. Hair grooming reflected status and identity. Carefully maintained beards in Assyrian and Persian societies were shaped and sometimes darkened with plant-based dyes. In some cases, false hair pieces were used to enhance fullness and symmetry. Class differences were clear. Rare resins and imported spices were reserved for elites. The scent of cinnamon or exotic myrrh drifting from garments announced wealth before a word was spoken. In desert climates, fragrance also masked sweat and heat. Practical need blended with ritual significance. Across the Levant and Arabia, cosmetics emphasized what could not be seen from afar, the invisible aura of scent. Beauty was carried in the air. To smell divine was to suggest closeness to the divine. In these regions, appearance extended beyond sight, it became atmosphere. As ancient societies grew more complex, cosmetics became something more than personal choice. They became regulation. Beauty began to signal not just taste, but hierarchy. In many civilizations, laws and social expectations governed who could wear what, how much, and when. Cosmetics were no longer only cultural expressions, they were controlled symbols of status. In ancient Rome, moralists openly criticized women who wore heavy makeup. Philosophers argued that excessive adornment disguised truth and corrupted virtue. Yet, elite women were expected to appear polished in public. The contradiction was sharp: adorn yourself, but not too much. Be beautiful, but do not appear vain. In Greece, restraint was admired. In China, modesty aligned with Confucian values. In India, spiritual symbolism regulated where and how adornment was applied. Across cultures, beauty was powerful and therefore monitored. Class differences were especially visible. The wealthy accessed rare minerals, imported perfumes, and skilled attendants to prepare elaborate looks. Enslaved workers or servants often applied cosmetics daily for aristocratic households. Beauty labor intensive and hierarchical, a noble woman's smooth complexion depended on the invisible work of others. Meanwhile, the poor relied on local herbs, simple oils, and basic pigments. Their cosmetics were practical rather than luxurious. Yet, even modest adornment carried meaning. A carefully lined eye or scented oil could signal dignity in harsh conditions. Gender expectations also shaped cosmetic use. While many ancient cultures allowed men to wear certain cosmetics, especially eyeliner or fragrance, women were more closely scrutinized. Beauty intertwined with marriage prospects, fertility, and family honor. Cosmetics could even reflect political shifts. As empires expanded, imported ingredients became fashionable, trade routes influenced trends. A pigment from one region might suddenly dominate elite courts elsewhere. Beauty followed power. What remains consistent across civilizations is this: cosmetics were never neutral. They communicated wealth, morality, devotion, and belonging. They could elevate social standing or invite criticism. They empowered individuals while reinforcing social order. Ancient cosmetics reveal something enduring about human societies. Beauty is admired, but it is also regulated. The painted face, the scented hair, the powdered skin, each became part of a broader system of class and control, and that system would echo through history long after empires fell. By the end of the ancient world, cosmetics had become deeply embedded in human culture. What began as mineral powders and scented oils had evolved into complex rituals that shaped identity across continents. Empires fell, trade routes shifted, religions transformed societies. Yet, the language of adornment endured. Ancient Egypt's kohl did not disappear. It traveled, adapted, and reappeared in different forms across the Mediterranean and the Middle East. The Roman fascination with skin creams and fragrance influenced medieval European beauty practices. Chinese powdered complexions inspired later dynastic trends. Indian kajil and henna traditions continued through centuries of cultural continuity. The ingredients changed, the meaning shifted, but the impulse remained the same. Across civilizations, cosmetics reflected deeper anxieties and desires. People sought protection from illness and spiritual harm. They sought signs of youth in aging bodies. They sought markers of status in competitive societies. They sought alignment with gods, traditions, and social expectations. Beauty was never trivial, it was communication. Ancient cosmetics also reveal something profoundly human. The body has always been a canvas of belief. A line of pigment around the eye could mean divine protection. A dab of perfume could signal hospitality. A pale face could indicate privilege. A red stain on the lips could suggest vitality. Even the risks, the toxic lead powders, the harsh mineral dyes tell a story. People were willing to endure discomfort or danger for social acceptance, admiration, or spiritual reassurance. That tension between enhancement and harm is not new. It stretches back thousands of years. Modern beauty industries may feel advanced, with laboratories and marketing campaigns replacing temple workshops and home remedies. Yet the foundations are ancient. We still moisturize dry skin. We still darken or highlight our eyes. We still use fragrance to shape first impressions. The tools have evolved. The motivations have not. Ancient cosmetics were not about shallow vanity. They were about belonging to a class, to a culture, to a faith. From kohl-lined eyes along the Nile to perfumed oils in Roman villas, beauty was a reflection of the world people lived in. And in many ways, it still is.